On June 8, 793 AD, a monastery was destroyed, and the world was never quite the same again. On a June morning, in the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne were beginning their prayers. Founded in 635 AD by the Irish monk Aidan on a windswept tidal island off the northeast coast of Northumbria, it was the most sacred site in all of Christian England, the home of the relics of St. Cuthbert endowed by kings, visited by pilgrims. The Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the greatest artistic achievements of the early medieval world, had been illuminated here by the monk Edfrith around 715 AD. The North Sea stretched gray and cold before the island. The monks had no warning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record that strange omens had appeared earlier that year. Immense lightning, fiery dragons seen flying through the air. But whether those accounts were written with hindsight, we cannot say. What we know is that on June 8th, there was no English navy, no coastal garrison, no fortification capable of stopping what came from the sea. The longships appeared like ghosts from the fog, dragon-head prows cutting through the waves with terrifying speed, warriors streaming from the vessels, tall, fierce men wielding axes and swords, tearing through the monastery with systematic brutality. Monks were slain, some were thrown into the sea to drown, others were taken in chains. The Church of St. Cuthbert, in the words of the scholar Alcuin of York, who learned of the raid while living at the court of Emperor Charlemagne, was spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its furnishings, exposed to the plundering of pagans. Who were these men, and what set them in motion? After Lindisfarne came a cascade. In 794, the Vikings struck Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had written his ecclesiastical history. In 795, they sacked Iona, Scotland's most important monastery, founded by Columba in 563 AD. By the 830s, raids had become systematic across Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire. Christian chroniclers recorded these events with horror, calling the raids God's punishment for the sins of the faithful. But the question that matters is not what did they do, it is why then? Why did this particular moment produce this particular explosion? To understand that, we must travel back to the land they came from. The world that made the Vikings. Scandinavia in the 8th century was a land of extraordinary natural beauty and extraordinary natural hardship. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were a world of mountains, dense forests, and fjords. Those narrow inlets carved into the coastline by glaciers, some reaching over 200 kilometers inland. This was a land defined by water, and its people were defined by their relationship to it. The climate was brutal. Winters were long, dark, and punishing. Only about 3% of Norway's total landmass was suitable for cultivation. The population was growing, improved farming techniques had allowed more people to survive, but there was never enough farmland to support them all. Throughout much of Scandinavia, the eldest son inherited the farm. Younger sons inherited nothing but their names, their skills, and their ambitions. What options remained for those landless younger sons? A life of service, a life of trade, or the sea, which offered freedom, fortune, and the chance to seize what inheritance had denied. But to do anything at sea required a ship, and this is where the Viking story takes its most remarkable turn. What made the Viking longship so revolutionary and so terrifying? The longship was not just a boat, it was the most sophisticated military weapon the early medieval world had ever produced. The Viking longship was an engineering achievement, centuries ahead of its time. Built using the clinker technique, overlapping oak planks riveted together with iron nails and caulked with wool and tar, the hull achieved qualities no other ship of the period could match. A single plank could be as thin as 1 inch, while remaining structurally sound because the wood was riven, split along the grain, rather than sawn across it. The result was a hull that was both strong and extraordinarily flexible. Unlike the rigid vessels of other European peoples, a Viking longship could flex and absorb the shock of ocean swells rather than breaking against them, a structural principle that modern engineers have recognized as remarkably advanced for its era. The ships were built around shallow draft. Most had a maximum depth in the water of between 0.5 and 1 meter. This changed everything. Other European vessels required deep harbors and navigable channels. A Viking longship could sail up any river, beach itself on a sand or gravel shoreline, and be dragged overland if necessary. It was not simply a weapon of the sea, it was a weapon of geography. Any coastline, any river mouth, any shallow beach was a door the Vikings could open. Powered by oar and a single square woolen sail, the largest longships, the draker, meaning dragon, could reach speeds of up to 15 knots. A journey from Western Norway to the British Isles could be completed in 2 to 3 days. The crews were supremely skilled mariners who navigated by stars, sun position, wave patterns, and bird behavior, carrying generations of accumulated knowledge about the North Atlantic that no other seafaring culture possessed. Storm season. The raids that began at Lindisfarne in 793 were not the random violence of a lawless people. They were rational, calculated, economic decisions. Christian monasteries in 8th century England and Ireland were almost perfectly designed targets. Repositories of extraordinary wealth accumulated over generations through royal gifts, land grants, and the donations of the faithful, gold chalices, silver crosses, illuminated manuscripts, coin hoards. They were also virtually undefended. Monks were not warriors. Their ideology specifically rejected armed resistance, and they sat on exposed coastlines and isolated islands, accessible by sea, far from any garrison. The scholar Al-Cuin, writing from Charlemagne's court after Lindisfarne, captured the shock of the Christian world in a letter that survives today. He wrote that such a voyage was not thought possible, that the geography which seemed to protect the island monasteries had, in fact, made them irresistible. He concluded with the theology of his time that the raid was divine punishment for Northumbrian sins. But what he could not yet know was that this was not a one-time catastrophe. It was an opening act. In 865, Viking activity in England transformed entirely. What had been raids became invasion. A vast coalition of Scandinavian warriors, called the Great Heathen Army in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. Its leaders included Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba, warriors of fearsome reputation, whose names still echo across the historical record. For more than a decade, the Great Heathen Army marched through England. In November 866, they seized York, the great city of the north, which the Vikings renamed Jorvik. By 869, East Anglia had fallen. By 874, Mercia had collapsed, its king driven into exile in Rome. 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen within a decade. Only one remained. How does a kingdom survive when everything around it has fallen? In January 878, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on Wessex, catching King Alfred entirely off guard. Alfred was forced to flee into the marshes of Somerset, sheltering with a small band at Athelney, an island of higher ground, surrounded by swampland. The chronicles record that during this desperate period, Alfred famously allowed a peasant woman's cakes to burn while distracted with worry, a story that captures the uncertainty of those weeks. But Alfred did not collapse. he sent messengers throughout Wessex, calling his nobility to a secret rallying point at Egbert's Stone. In May 878, Alfred emerged from hiding with a reconstituted army and crushed Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. Guthrum retreated, agreed to negotiations, and accepted baptism as a Christian, taking the name Ethelstan with Alfred as his godfather. The result was the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, a formal division of England. South and west was Anglo-Saxon England under Alfred. North and east was the Danelaw, Danish customs, Danish settlement. Hundreds of English words in daily use have Old Norse roots: window, sky, husband, knife, egg, sister, window, anger, husband, ugly, sister, die, anger, ugly, die. On the town name suffix by, as in Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, is entirely Norse. The Danelaw left a fingerprint on England that has never fully faded. Edges of the world. While other Europeans feared the ocean's edge, the Vikings sailed toward it on purpose. The raids and conquests were only one dimension of Viking expansion. Other Norse seafarers were pushing west into the Atlantic, further than any European had gone. The first stepping stone was Iceland. Norse settlers began arriving around 870 AD, drawn by reports from earlier explorers. Iceland was a volcanic island in the North Atlantic, essentially uninhabited at the time, though Irish monks may have reached it earlier and departed. By 930 AD, Iceland had a settled Norse population of approximately 60,000 people. That same year, the settlers established the Althing, a national assembly held annually at a volcanic plain called Thingvellir, where freemen gathered to settle disputes, establish laws, and make collective decisions. It is one of the oldest, continuously functioning parliaments in the world, founded on the radical principle that law belonged not to a king, but to the community. From Iceland, the Norse pushed further. Around 985 AD, warrior named Eric Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red, sailed west from Iceland. Eric had been declared an outlaw, following violent disputes that resulted in several deaths, and had nowhere to return to. He sailed west into open ocean and found a vast island at the edge of the known world. He named it Greenland, almost certainly a deliberate act of marketing, since the island was largely ice. Around 5,000 Norse settlers eventually followed, establishing farms that would persist for nearly 500 years before mysteriously dying out around 1450. But what came next is perhaps the most extraordinary fact in all of medieval history. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and made landfall on North America. The sagas describe three regions: Helluland, possibly Baffin Island; Markland, possibly Labrador; and Vinland, where he wintered, thought to correspond to the northern tip of Newfoundland. Later expeditions, including one led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, tried to build a lasting colony. They were ultimately repelled by conflicts with indigenous peoples called Skraelings in the Norse accounts. The Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. For centuries, this was dismissed as romantic legend. Then in 1960, Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein began excavating at Lance aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. What they found and was unmistakable: the foundations of 8 Norse buildings, iron-working tools consistent with Scandinavian metalworking, and artifacts that placed the site firmly in the Viking Age. The sagas had been telling the truth all along. The road to Constantinople. While Norse Vikings were pushing across the Atlantic and British Isles, Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians, from the Old Norse Varangar, were moving in an entirely different direction, east. Beginning in the late 8th century, Varangian traders and warriors penetrated deep into what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, traveling the great river systems, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian. These rivers were the highways of Eurasia, and the Varangians controlled them. The wealth at the end of these river routes was extraordinary. Byzantine Constantinople was the richest city in the world. The Muslim Caliphate, centered in Baghdad under the Abbasid dynasty, was at the height of its golden age. Both civilizations had commodities the Norse world needed: silver dirhams, silk, spices, glassware. In exchange, the Varangians offered what northern forests and cold seas produced: furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves. The Varangians didn't merely trade along these rivers. They also built political structures. The Rusu, a term most historians connect to these Scandinavian settlers, established trading towns that were along the river routes. According to the primary chronicle, a 12th century account of Kievan Rus history, Slavic and Finnish tribes invited a Varangian chief named Rurik to rule over them in Novgorod in 862 AD, founding the Rurik dynasty. Whatever the precise circumstances, the dynasty Rurik founded would rule Russia and the surrounding Slavic kingdoms for over 700 years, until 1598. How far east did the Vikings actually reach? Some Vikings traveled all the way to Constantinople and became the emperor's personal bodyguard. By around 988 AD, the arrangement had been formalized into what history calls the Varangian Guard, an elite regiment of Norse warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor himself. They were the inner ring of imperial protection. The men who stood in the throne room escorted the emperor in public and slept at the doors of his chambers. The most famous member of the Varangian Guard was Harald Hardrada, Harald Sigurdsson, who served in Constantinople from around 1034 to 1042 AD, rising to command the guard itself. He accumulated vast wealth in Byzantine service, fought across the Mediterranean, then returned to become King of Norway. In 1066, the same year as the Norman conquest, he launched an invasion of England and was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by King Harold Godwinson. The arc of his life, from the Byzantine throne room to a battlefield in Yorkshire, maps the extraordinary geography of the Viking world. Normandy, the last transformation. France suffered Viking raids for decades. Beginning around 820 AD, Norse fleets appeared regularly along the French coastline, sailing up the Loire, the Seine, and the Garonne. In 845, a fleet of 120 Viking ships sailed up the Seine and captured Paris itself. The Frankish King Charles the Bald paid 7,000 pounds of silver to persuade the Vikings to leave, establishing the dangerous precedent of Danegeld in France and teaching the Vikings that the Franks would pay rather than fight. For nearly a century, the Frankish kings tried and failed to stop the Norse raids. Fortified bridges were built across rivers. Standing militias were organized. Ransoms were paid. Nothing worked permanently. By the early 10th century, a Viking chieftain named Hrolf, known in the Latin records as Rollo and in later Icelandic sagas as Gangarhrolf, meaning Rolf the Walker, reportedly so large that no horse could carry him, had established a permanent Norse settlement along the lower Seine, centering on the city of Rouen. In the spring of 911, Rollo led an attack on Chartres, south of Paris, a siege that failed when Frankish forces defeated the Viking army on July 20th. Rather than continuing a war of attrition, the Frankish king Charles III, known as Charles the Simple, chose a different strategy. He invited Rollo to negotiate. The talks were held at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, between Rouen and Paris. The result was one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements of the medieval world. The terms were simple but revolutionary. Charles granted Rollo a large territory along the lower Seine in full possession. In exchange, Rollo pledged loyalty to the Frankish crown, promised to defend the territory against further Viking raids, and agreed to be baptized as a Christian, taking the name Robert, in Rouen Cathedral in 912 AD. The territory became known as Normandy, from Northmania, the land of the Northmen. What happens when Vikings spent 5 generations in France. The transformation of the Normans over the following century is one of the most fascinating stories of cultural adaptation in European history. Within 2 generations, Norse language had been replaced by Old French. Norse gods gave way to Christian ones, yet the military ferocity of the original Vikings did not diminish. It became more directed, more disciplined, more formidable. The Normans became not raiders, but conquerors, systematic, organized, and extraordinarily effective. In September 1066, Duke William of Normandy, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, crossed the English Channel with an army of approximately 7,000 men. On October 14, at Hastings, William met King Harold Godwinson, the same Harold who had killed Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. Less than 3 weeks earlier, Harold was killed, his army destroyed, and William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest transformed England entirely. Old English, or the language of Beowulf, was overwhelmed by Norman French. Thousands of new words entered English: government, parliament, justice, noble, castle, religion, beef, pork, villain. The entire Anglo-Saxon ruling class was replaced. Church, law, architecture, literature, every major institution was remade. The conquest was the founding event of modern English identity, and its architects were the descendants of Vikings who had lived in France for 5 generations. The longships' legacy. The Vikings didn't just raid history, they built it, and the world they built is in many ways still the world we inhabit. The Viking legacy is not simple. In the historical sources written by their contemporaries, almost all of them Christian monks and scholars, the Vikings appear as instruments of divine punishment, heathens who desecrated the sacred. This portrait is not without truth. The raids were real, the violence was real. Monks were killed, monasteries were burned, entire communities enslaved. But modern archaeology tells a more complete story. The same culture that raided Lindisfarne produced the Oseberg ship, a masterpiece discovered in a Norwegian burial mound, dated to around 820 AD, decorated with carved wood of extraordinary delicacy. The same culture produced the Eddas and the Sagas, a body of literature, preserving Norse mythology and history with philosophical depth. The same culture also established at Iceland's Althing, one of the earliest democratic assemblies in human history. Consider the geographic reach from the monastery at Lindisfarne in northeast England to the throne room of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, from Newfoundland in North America to the markets of Baghdad. A small population from the cold edges of Northern Europe, operating for approximately 300 years, projected its presence across nearly half the globe, without a centralized state, without imperial design, through technology, seamanship, and an extraordinary willingness to go further than anyone else believed possible. The Viking Age ended not with a catastrophe, but with a transformation. By the late 11th century, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had been Christianized and centralized into stable monarchies. The energy that had once been directed outward toward raids, exploration, and conquest was redirected inward. The last great figure of the Viking Age, Harold Hardrada, died at Stamford Bridge in 1066, and in that same year, his distant kinsman, William of Normandy, completed the final Viking transformation, the creation of a new English kingdom built on foundations laid by men from the north. What does a people leave behind when the storm has passed? Viking DNA is measurably present in the modern populations of Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Normandy, and Russia. The linguistic fingerprints of Old Norse are woven into English, Russian, and Irish. Iceland's Althing fed through the centuries into the development of parliamentary democracy. The longships' innovations in hull design and flexible planking influenced European shipbuilding for centuries. And the geographic consciousness the Vikings introduced, the knowledge that the world was larger and more connected than any previous culture imagined, changed what Europeans thought was possible. We tend to remember the Vikings through the image of the longship's dragon prow cutting through gray water. And that image is not wrong. They were warriors. They caused immense suffering. But they were also builders, traders, explorers, poets, and lawmakers. They remind us that civilization and destruction are not opposite forces. They are different expressions of the same drive to expand, to connect, to leave something that remains. I am Ben. Together, we follow the fragments left behind to understand not just where we came from, but what it means to have been here at all. I'll see you in the next chapter.